All right, we're working our way through the Bible and we've come to the book of Job. Job is one of the wisdom books. You know that many of the books in the Old Testament are telling a story about Israel and how God's going to save through Israel. Other books in the Old Testament are kind of explaining what's going on with that story. And then there are books in the Old Testament that we describe as wisdom books. And they're a little different in that they are stepping back, in a sense, and just looking at life in this world and asking, how is it supposed to work? How did God design this world to work? And so one of those wisdom books is Proverbs. And Proverbs says God rewards those who seek him and God punishes those who don't. It's obviously more nuanced than that, but Proverbs kind of treats life almost as if that's how it always worked. And Ecclesiastes comes onto the scene, written by the same person who wrote most of Proverbs, actually. So this is definitely not a contradiction. It's just adding nuance. Ecclesiastes comes onto the scene and says, wait a second, there's a glitch in how this world works because of sin. The righteous aren't always rewarded. The wicked aren't always punished, in this world at least. And every single one of them dies. So how are we supposed to understand that? And Job is an example of how things aren't always so simple. Job gives us a very vivid illustration of someone who was righteous and who suffered. And it causes us to ask questions about God. How are we supposed to understand that? What are we to think about God when the righteous suffer and the wicked do well? I once heard someone describe Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job almost like three people you might meet in a restaurant or something. And Proverbs is the young professor, young lady professor who just knows all the answers. Bang, 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 bang. Ecclesiastes is more like the middle-aged poet, the guy with the beanie on his head, and he's sort of like a little bit cynical and says, but wait, it doesn't always work like that. And Job is the wise old man who's been through it all and wants to help you understand how God designed this world to work. Job is a wisdom book. It's part of the wisdom genre, but it's also a book actually that questions human wisdom. One of the big questions in the book of Job is about the limits of human wisdom. Are we really able to understand how this world works? We don't know for sure the author and date of Job, besides the fact that we do know it was ultimately written by God. It's inspired, but we don't know the human author. And actually, when you talk about the date, there are two questions you could ask. You could ask, when was Job written, and when did the things that took place in Job happen? And obviously, the things that took place in Job happened very early on. In fact, most people would say what happens in Job happens right around the days of Abraham. And there are good reasons to think that it was a book that was written very early as well. For example, Job's age is 140 years old. That's consistent with the ages of men we find in the patriarchal period. Job uses a unit of measurement that you don't find later in history. Job's wealth is calculated not by coin or weight like you might find in Solomon's time, but by livestock, the way you would calculate wealth in the time of the patriarchs. Shaddai is used to describe God, which apparently was an early term for God in the Bible. And there's no mention of tabernacle, Israel, priesthood. There's no talk of a central place of worship. One of the scholars that I trust says that he believes Job was the first book ever written in the Bible. And there are parts of the Pentateuch that took place earlier. There are events in the Pentateuch that took place earlier, obviously like the creation of the world, but we would say the Pentateuch was written after Job. To say it another way, just to kind of make it clear, when Moses wrote the first 5 books of the law, he had one book, and that was the book of Job. And I think it's helpful to see the book of Job like that. You might even read the Bible chronologically with Job as the very first book that you read. And that is helpful because one of the things that Job shows us is how desperately we need special revelation. We can't understand God's purposes apart from special revelation. And so this book, you can think of this book as standing at the beginning of the Bible to say, this is why we need the Bible. Its setting is very generic. It's obviously not taking place in Israel. It's set in Uz. I love how it begins. There was a man in the land of Uz. All the people in Job are non-Israelites. Interesting that there are godly people outside of Israel at this time. Also, it's intentional. It's intentionally non-Israelite as a way of saying, look, what's here is not just a story about some Israelite person. This is wisdom for all people. Everybody needs to know this about the Bible, and everybody needs to know this about God. Now, why was Job written? What's its purpose? We usually would think, well, Job was written to help us understand why humans suffer. Why do the righteous suffer? And that's true. It does help us think about that, but the purpose of Job is actually bigger than that. Job is a book about God. You very rarely, by the way, go wrong when you're studying the Bible if you step back and think, what does this teach me about God? The Bible is ultimately a book about God. And Job, definitely, specifically, is a book about God. And suffering is, you might say, as one person has put it, suffering is the window or the vehicle for the message. When people suffer, they start asking the bigger questions. And those questions are the key to the book. There are 2 courtroom scenes in Job, at least. And someone is on trial, you might say, in the book of Job. And basically, it's God. Is God right in the way that he governs this universe? Satan and Job are both asking that question. Everyone is asking that question. Does God know what he's doing? Satan comes to God and basically says, these people only love you because you are treating them well. And beyond that, Job and his friends, they're questioning God on the basis of a certain way of looking at the world and how they think the world's supposed to work. What's happening to Job doesn't make sense according to their wisdom. James Smith explains, before his ordeal, Job viewed God as mandated to always act in certain ordered and predictable ways. Job agreed with his friends that God was responsible for his sufferings. They argue from their orderly worldview that Job must have sinned, else he would not be punished with suffering. Job argues from his personal experience of righteousness that his suffering cannot be punishment for sin he has committed, because he has not committed a sin worthy of that punishment. Nor will he accept that he's being tested. What he's experienced, he goes on to say, is torture, not testing. Therefore, Job demands an explanation from God, although he realizes the hopelessness of any prospect of divine redress. For Job, it's not so much suffering which has become problematic, it's God himself. The challenge is, can Job trust a God who's totally sovereign and whose activities cannot fully be explained by the dictates of philosophy or theology? Which is a good question, a question that many of us might have. And part of Job's purpose, I think, is to say, well, you can look out and try to understand the world as best as you can, and you should do that. Your understanding of this world is always going to be limited as a human being. It's not going to be completely accurate. If you're going to understand how this world works, you need a better understanding of God. And you need to learn to trust God's wisdom if you're going to be able to live for God in this world. Now, where is this wisdom that we so desperately need, divine wisdom, where is that found? Now, obviously, Job can be a challenging book to understand. First of all, it's important to remember that it is a big book. Some people act as if the only thing that was important about Job was the beginning and the end, and they forget the middle. There's a professor named Abner Chou who has done a series of lectures on Job. I think you can find them at SoundCloud, and just absolutely excellent. You can even go there now if you want. Really good. But Abner Chou explains, this view says Job is about his suffering and faithfulness. But this excludes 90% of the book. Otherwise, he really could have ended at chapter 2. Why doesn't Job end at chapter 2? Or why is there this long section in the middle? Now, one reason we don't like the middle and we get confused by the middle is because the friends of Job are so hard to understand. Are they good? Are they bad? What do we do? Abner Chou suggests avoiding 3 mistakes when you read the middle of Job. First of all, he says there's the fallacy. Job's counselors just repeat themselves. That's a fallacy. That's a mistake that sometimes people make. Job's friends aren't purely repetitious. They make arguments, and their arguments develop deeper and deeper, and their arguments vary. They display their worldviews as they unpack their wisdom. So as you read through the Job and you look at the friends' arguments, be asking, what are they saying that's the same? What are they saying that's different? Another common mistake is Job's friends are just stupid. They aren't stupid, that's for sure. If you look at what they say and how they say it, they're geniuses. Job doesn't have friends from low places. They're very smart and capable. Their arguments are actually pretty astonishing. They make fun of each other over and over while discussing deep philosophy, while rhyming, doing poetry at least. Abner Chou says, to put it in modern terms, they make fun of each other, discuss deep philosophy on the fly so that it all rhymes like a rap. Amazing. A third mistake sometimes people make, Job's counselors were always wrong. Now, they were wrong a lot of times, but the New Testament quotes Job's counselors actually at times as being correct. You can look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 15 and Job 23:10. Often, what they say is actually right, but how they use it is wrong. So it's the wrong application of the right doctrine. Now, of course, the wrong application of the right doctrine is still wrong. They were using truth poorly. Using truth rightly is what we call wisdom. And that's the issue. It's not just having ideas, but it is putting those ideas together in the right ways. And that's the limitation of human wisdom. You can't put it all together and come to ultimate wisdom without revelation. Now, for me, the hardest of all the counselors is Elihu. And he's not mentioned with the 3 friends in the beginning, so he seems to be in his own category. He's not really rebuked like the other ones are in the end. And yet he says some things that are similar, but if you look a little more closely, he also says some things that are different. I was reading someone who said, perhaps no other biblical character has been characterized by scholars in such radically different ways as Elihu. Concerning wisdom, Elihu is described as either an exceedingly wise man or a buffoon. Concerning his motivation, he's seen as anything from divinely inspired to the person assumed or adopted by Satan to attack Job. Concerning his contribution to the book of Job, he's considered to be irrelevant or absolutely essential. But if you look at Elihu, you'll notice he says something different. It's not just that you're wicked and so God's punishing you. He's saying God can't be forced to do anything, actually, by us and by our actions, but he does use suffering as a means to accomplish something good in our lives. So Elihu is not just saying, look, Job, you must be wicked. He's saying, no, God is using this suffering, though. And then second, he seems to come onto the scene to help us transition from the foolish talk of the friends to the point where we're ready to listen to God. So the discussions that were being had before were pretty man-focused. And so Elihu comes onto the scene to just refocus us on God. And what he says about God is good. It's also limited, and there are parts of it that are not quite right. But he's transitioning us so that we can hear from God at the end of the book. If you're going to understand Job, it's a big book. That's important. It's not just the first chapters and the final chapters that are important. It's all important. Second, God is the main character. I think we have a hard time with this book because we live our lives with ourselves at the center and God on the outskirts. So we're testing God, and God has to conform to our expectations. But the book of Job turns that on its head. It presents us a big picture of God. And there's two examples of that. First of all, the way it deals with the problem of evil. How do we deal with the problem of evil? We blame God. We come up with things. We say, well, if God was all-powerful, there wouldn't be evil. Or if God was good, there wouldn't be evil. But they just accepted the fact that God was both powerful and righteous. And they were asking why. What's going on? And Job says, the answer is God. God is bigger and wiser and better than you could imagine. Your view of God is too limited. And then another example is the way it presents Satan. Some people think of the book of Job as Satan manipulating God, or Satan's dare to God. But if you look closely, Satan isn't the one who suggests all this to God. God suggests what takes place. And that changes everything. This isn't a book about Satan manipulating God, but God's choice to prove something about himself. And then third, we need to remember our privilege as we study the book of Job. If you're going to benefit from this book, it's a big book, so you want to study it all. Second, it's a book about God. You got to get a right view of God. God, he really is this important. And then third, we are privileged. Job is a man trying to honor God in suffering without very much special revelation. And what Job does is make you hungry for revelation. We have so much more than Job did. Job, one man explains, will shape the way you read your entire Bible from here on out. It tells you why you need your Bible to begin with. If you had given Job the book of Romans, he would have cried for joy. But he must be kept in the dark so we know what questions to ask, questions that divine revelation as a whole answers. But if you do it Jeopardy style and give him the answers first, then he never would have asked the questions to begin with, and neither would we. Job is making us hungry for the rest of the Bible. Fourth, as you read Job, you need to understand that human wisdom is on trial. So there's a way that we as humans think about things. Some people would call this the divine retribution principle, the DR principle. And you see it definitely here in Job. And this basic approach to life is based on the doctrine of cosmic justice. So we got this idea. God punishes sin and God rewards righteousness. And that's true. Proverbs talks about that quite a bit. But there's more. And yet in Job, this is how these humans are trying to make sense of the world. They're saying, well, it just all has to fit into this little box. God rewards the righteous and God punishes the wicked. And the book of Job says that doesn't work, or at least that answer isn't adequate. That's why Job and his friends are fighting, and they're fighting so angrily. They're angry at each other because their whole world is coming undone. They have this way of thinking, and what's happening to Job is just throwing it all out of balance. If someone's throwing your world upside down and you can't refute him, you start to become angry and bitter, and you start wanting to take it out on him personally. If you want to understand their arguments, it's not super complicated. They're saying you're suffering, so you must have sinned. And Job is saying, I know suffering is a result of sin, but I didn't sin. So what? So what's going on? At the end, though, God rebukes the human counselors, and Job repents. And he realizes, if you're going to understand this world, you need a wisdom that is above human wisdom. Abner Chou, again, he explains, the divine retribution principle is the ancient principle that if you sin, God will punish you. What goes around comes around. More or less, this is the foundation for the arguments in Job. But we find out that man's wisdom uses this principle to argue either for man's innocence or God's innocence, not both. This forms an impasse because it seems to bring us to an either-or equation. All the questions of righteousness in Job are tied to this conundrum. God afflicts Job for the express purpose of drawing out of him the deepest questions possible so that he could reveal how much we need his revelation. Humans can't figure it or him out. That's Job 28:8. The best we can do on our own is the divine retribution principle, which is bogus. Some scholars say God doesn't answer Job, but he does through the wishes of Job. And God replaces the DR principle with the wisdom of God in the gospel, which is greater than man's wisdom, the wisdom which can never discern truth in the world. Man can't just figure things out. This is why at the end of the book, Job has to repent, because Job was wrong. And the gospel then is the way God really set up the world. The irony is thick in the book because Job doesn't know. And this is what makes it a good prequel. Because now, after having studied Job, you know what to look for in the rest of the Bible. Namely, God proving his wisdom right through the gospel.